I have a controversial opinion about Powerless by Lauren Roberts. Mostly because, unlike 99% of book talk and booktube, I didn't like it. Let's talk about it. Before we get started today with the review of Powerless by Lauren Roberts, I want to remind you to do the YouTubey things. Go ahead and like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification bell so that you never miss an episode. It helps the algorithm know that this brand new YouTube creator might actually be worth it and will send my video out to more people. It really does help, so I thank you in advance for doing that. Now for the review. So I was thinking about doing a disclaimer and saying, these are all my opinions and whatnot, but this is my channel and I am imagining that you're here to get my actual opinion about this book. So I will say, I feel very passionately about this book in the negative because it had the potential to be incredible. I feel like this book had all of the foundations to be a next staple of the YA genre, but it just didn't get there. And the biggest reasons is it copied almost everything from other books. It just cut and paste, dropped it in to this novel from other very well-known staples of the young adult genre. So, overall thoughts of Powerless. I have my notes. My overall thoughts of Powerless, it's a complete ripoff of Red Queen and Hunger Games with splashes of The Selection and Harry Potter. It's such a ripoff of Red Queen that it's almost like straight scenes are pulled from Red Queen and put into Powerless, including the way that the main female character and the main male character meet is her pickpocketing him and them having kind of this connecting experience with each other where they kind of are interested in one another. There's no real depth to these characters that I felt like Peyton, or excuse me, not Peyton, Peyton, who is our female protagonist, is kind of two-dimensional. She is antagonistic, kind of rude, chip on her shoulder, thinks that she can do everything better than other people, doesn't trust anyone, but at the same time seems to fall into trust with certain people that doesn't make any kind of sense. She never really changes or develops as a character throughout the book, and that really bothered me, especially since this book is pretty long. I think it's almost 500 pages. I think it's like 460 something. So it kind of frustrated me. Kai is your stereotypical male protagonist in the young adult genre, tall, dark, and broody, and, you know, has kind of this dark edge to him where he's kind of violent and a little dangerous, but that makes you, as the reader, you're supposed to at least, be more interested in him. And we are told on a regular occurrence that he is very attractive, so, you know, there's that as well. General plot. Powerless is the story of a society where there was a plague that killed off most of the inhabitants of the land, and those that were left behind developed special powers. Now, not everyone developed special powers. There were still people that they called ordinaries who didn't have powers, and the king, through a propaganda mission, I can't think of the word right now, but he sent out into the society that these ordinaries were bad, they were going to water down the blood, and somehow everyone was going to lose their powers. So he made it illegal to be an ordinary in his kingdom and literally commits genocide and kills all of the ordinaries that are in the society, in the country, and there is an enforcer who is supposed to enforce this law. So there's two sons. There's the heir, whose name is Kit, and the spare, as it were, who is the enforcer. And both of them have been raised their entire lives to be those individuals. So we meet Peyton, who is an ordinary, doesn't have powers, and then we have Kai, who's the enforcer, who does have powers, and they meet and she somehow saves his life, even though she doesn't have powers, but she was trained by her father her entire life to be a fighter, even though her father was a healer, and it doesn't really make sense as to why he would know how to fight. But she saves his life, and in so doing is rewarded by being entered into the Purging Trials, which is a commemorative celebration where there is fight to the death with the elite members of the youth society in these trials that happen commemorating the purge of the society. That's the general idea of the plot. The rest of the book, after she is brought into the trials, Peyton is brought into the trials, is a lot of lustful longing and kind of random occurrences that don't make a lot of sense, which we'll get into through the rest of the book until the very end, where she has to run away because there's a rebellion that she gets involved with, and that's the end of the book. It's kind of... it's two-dimensional, and like I said, it's a complete ripoff of Red Queen. The biggest difference from Red Queen to this book, to Powerless, is that Mare in Red Queen had powers and she wasn't supposed to. And Peyton does not have powers and she's supposed to. But they still have to hide their nature. They have to try and navigate the political sphere and these instances where their powers are, you know, having to be used and they're having to prove it, except Peyton's power becomes obsolete and is never really spoken again after maybe the first 100 pages of the book. Quite literally, she never uses it again. So let me explain how they got around the power thing. Her father knew that she didn't have powers and so trained her to be basically Sherlock Holmes, to have unbelievable powers of observation. So her power is being a psychic. So she's able to look at someone and tell them everything about themselves or what just happened or situations in their lives. We get an instance of this happening with a guard. The guard gets really mad and he hits her. There's a lot of violence in this book, like a lot of violence that I felt like it kind of got... It went a little bit too far for me just because the violence had no point. If there's a point to the violence, I'm all for it. I loved the Hunger Games. I think the violence in that was such a good tool used to show the brutality and the evil nature of the capital and of the governing body. But in this one, it just seems pointless. There's no real reason or logic behind any of it. So we have Peyton, who has this psychic ability, and it's brought up, like at the beginning, it's also brought up that Kai, who is able to sense other people's powers and like siphon them and use them for himself, he can't sense a power in her. And she says, well, it's because I'm psychic. And you know, silencers, who are... this is also totally ripped from Red Queen. Silencers are able to mute and silence their other people's abilities and somehow can take it even farther and like kill them if they wanted to. But she makes a point, Peyton makes a point to say, well, the silencer didn't affect me either. So it's just this thing. And we're supposed to believe that Kai, who has been trained his literal entire life in hunting down and finding ordinaries and killing them, doesn't realize that she's an ordinary in those first moments because of her explanation that she's a psychic. And he's never encountered one of those before, so he can't feel it. Okay, we'll go with that. All right, so one thing about Kai, I feel like Kai could have been a very interesting character. We're introduced to him via him being sent out on an enforcement duty. He is supposed to go hunt down a family who's supposedly harboring an ordinary child and execute the child and banish the family. So he gets there, they find the child, and he's like, oh, she's so young. Okay, she tells the guards, take the family out to the dunes and like banish them from the city, where they'll most likely die because there's this huge sand dune like sea between them and the country. So the likelihood of them making it is almost not, like, zero. And then he takes the girl who he's supposed to be executing, and instead of doing that, he takes her roundabout to the family in the sand dunes. So the family that was just banished and pretty much guaranteed is going to die out in the sand dunes, to appease his own guilt, he doesn't kill the child. He reunites her with her family, and he actually says, like, they're probably going to die out in the not forest, the sand dunes anyway. So how was that helpful? So I loved this idea that he had a problem with it and he had boundaries and he did not want to kill people of a certain age. He didn't want to kill children and he didn't totally agree with it. But then he still delivers her essentially into death, but in a significantly more horrible way than if he had just slit her throat or cut off her head. Oh shoot, I hope YouTube doesn't get mad at me about those. But I feel like that was an instance where they were really, she was trying really hard. Lauren was trying really hard to show that he had depth and character, but it just doesn't work because he still condemned her to death. Just, he didn't have to be the hand of death, so it appeased his guilt. Anyway, yeah. Okay, so a couple of other things about these two main characters. Their first interaction with each other is antagonistic sexual banter. Like, they're both attracted to each other, but it's kind of this give and take antagonism. They're kind of rude to each other, but in a flirtatious way, so that it's okay, and they're being super sarcastic. Their relationship does not get beyond that. Literally the entire book. It never gets beyond them being antagonistic towards each other that we see as the reader, that we get privy to. We are told at a certain point that they ended up having a very deep conversation over the course of a couple of days, but we are not privy to that conversation, so we have no idea what happened, and we as the readers do not see it, so we don't care. It doesn't make any sense why they like each other to the level that they do, except for hormones, essentially. They're really lusty and they lust after each other. So that's a thing that happens. Let's go into now how I feel like this book is a complete ripoff of Red Queen. So there's a couple of obvious things that we've already talked about, like they have the powers, and Peyton doesn't have powers, and she's pretending it, but she's having to, hide her nature and who she is. Where Mare Barrow also did that in Red Queen. The exact same meet cute moment where the male and female protagonists meet each other for the very first time. The trials that end up, the purging trials that end up being a major part of this book are very similar to the Queen's trial. I feel like Lauren tried to make them a little bit different, but that was where the ripoff of the Hunger Games came from. So instead of trying to figure out something unique and different, she pulled from Harry Potter and the Hunger Games with these multiple trials that they had to get through, which also don't make sense, but we'll get to that in a minute. We've got an underground rebellion, which the rebellion thing is not new in any stretch of the imagination. It wasn't new in Red Queen either, but the way that the rebellion happens, it's pretty much the same thing, and that she has a family member who happened to be involved in Red Queen. It was her brother. In Powerless, it's her father who was the leader, and the rebellion is still currently running out of her old house that her father had been murdered in because it was discovered that he was a member of that rebellion. Because that makes sense. So those are kind of the last thing is the brother love triangle. So we've got Kit, who is the heir, and Kai, who is the enforcer, and they both have a thing for Peyton. And it is so obviously the same to Red Queen, it's almost obnoxious. The only difference is Kit is older and the guy that she really likes is Kai, who is a little bit younger. And that's the only difference. But we have the same type of slow build relationship with Kit, where you can see, oh, you really like, I could see this happening and you guys would like each other. But then she's got this lusty thing going on with Kai. And so she's more feeling for him, for Kai, than she is for Kit. But that same love triangle dynamic is happening exactly the same as Red Queen. So how it is Hunger Games-esque. The first trial of the purging is a straight ripoff of the Hunger Games. So after Peyton and Kai meet each other and she saves his life because he gets ambushed by a silencer who's trying to kill him, and she takes out all of her rage and anger on the establishment on this silencer, and she saves Kai's life. Well, like the next day, they release the names of all the people that are going to be in the purging trials, which are the commemorative trials for the purging of society of the ordinary. So they're celebrating genocide. They post the list of who is going to be participating, and it's a big honor to be participating. And there's discussion earlier on about how there are people picked from the slums that are put into the trials because it's supposed to be this honor, and they're wanting to, you know, bring the other people into it. But in reality, they're just like fodder and normally get killed off at the beginning of the trials anyway. And her name is on the list. Now, this is where I start to have some issues. She talks about how important it is that the public are a part of the trials. There's like a voting system. She was somehow elected. The people elected her to be in the trials. But we never, literally never see how this happens. There isn't an election day. Her name isn't publicized everywhere so that everyone would know that they needed to vote for her. Kai doesn't even know her name at that point, so he can't mysteriously just slip her name on the trials, like the list, and we never get an explanation ever on how the people influence the trials. There's a lot of talk throughout the entire book about how, oh, she's got to look good and she's got to put it on this show for people so that she can get their votes. But there is no explanation at any point as to what the voting does. And it's almost like it gets forgotten halfway through the book. So we're concerned about the voting. There's, pulling in a little bit from the selection. Once the trials are getting ready to begin, they bring all the contestants to the castle and they do an interview process so everyone can see their powers, and she gets to practice her psychic abilities on a whole bunch of different people. This is like one of 2 instances where she actually uses her powers. And then we get to never really see the audience again because all of the trials end up happening away from the public. And there are these people who have the ability called sight, where they're able to record what they're watching and then broadcast it later like a camera. So that's where I start to have issues, is that there's a major plot hole there. How did she get put on the list? And then how did the audience have anything to do with the process of the trials? Because never once does it come up how they're supposed to be influencing the trials. It's very frustrating. So we get the first trial and they're drugged the night before at a ball and they're dropped off in the middle of a forest all alone, and they have to survive for 6 days, and they have bands on each of the individual's arms that they have to gather, and whoever has the most bands wins. Reminds me a little bit of My Hero Academia and one of the school trials or the school competitions where they had headbands, and like one person's headband was worth 1,000,000 points and whatever. Anyway, I'm a big fan of My Hero Academia. But so they're all by themselves, and as they move through the forest, things are left there for them. Clothing, weapons, medicine. They have to figure out how to find shelter, how to stay warm, where to get food. I mean, it literally was the Hunger Games, but she just had it be in the first trial. So they talk about a little bit how there's death in these trials, that people do die, but that it's not necessarily a requirement, but that people do die during these trials. So we get the best of the best of the best, sir, in a competition where they're supposed to, but not really, fight to the death. In a society that values power, values being elite, putting their best to kill each other makes no freaking sense. It makes no sense. In the Hunger Games, it made sense because they were the Capitol was enforcing their will and constantly saying, see, we can make you do anything. Anything. But in Powerless, it doesn't make sense. It's supposed to be an honor to be put in these trials, and it's supposed to be a really big deal, but like, you're gonna die? Most likely? Like, what? But, whatever. Okay, so that's one thing. There's inconsistencies throughout the book with continuity. At one point, she says that it's been 30 years, and they've never had a trial outside of the bowl, which is where apparently it's like a giant arena. It's where they do the interviews. But this is only the 6th purging trial, and people, like, how does that work? I don't understand. Maybe I missed something. It's very possible that I missed something because I was reading this really fast, but that seemed kind of weird to me. So let's talk about the Resistance for a second. This is another thing that kind of bugged me. The Resistance has been around for quite a while, and they have been fighting like kind of underground, quietly. It's like a quiet resistance. It's not really a resistance. It's kind of just a little bit of a pushback. Not so much a resistance, like a true resistance or a rebellion, but like they kind of just, it's little. Enough that the government is able to keep it completely under wraps and nobody knows about this resistance. Well, through the trials, we find out that there are people in this resistance who are elites. They have powers. They are considered very dangerous. They're silencers. They're essentially people who have abilities that are very, very dangerous. Those people are helping the resistance, and the resistance is mixed up with Peyton's father. So she, for some reason, decides, I'm gonna go join this resistance and see if I can help, which, you know, isn't a problem and it makes total sense. But if she is trying to keep her head down and win the trials and survive, which she says in the interview when they ask her, well, what is your goal? And she says, my goal is to survive. That's it. Then why in the world would she get herself involved in something that is almost 100% going to get her killed? I think it would have been much more interesting to have the resistance come to her and say, hey, we want to pair with you. Your father was a member of the resistance. He was murdered because he was a resistance member. We want you to be with us, and have her say no, and have her be like, no, I'm trying to survive. I'm not doing your espionage crap. You do it on your own. But of course she doesn't do that. She joins the resistance. She's going to find out how to get to the special underground area tunnel system that will allow the resistance to come in. And the whole idea of the resistance makes total sense, that it's a bunch of ordinary people who are fighting back against this idea that they are diseased and that they are a plague on the elites, on the people with powers. But they mention things about lies and that they want to show the people that they're not really bad, whatever. And all of these things make sense. But the problem that I have with it is that their end goal is to get into the king's box on the third trial and then just tell people, hey, we're okay. We've been living among you for years and there's no problem with anybody's powers. I'm sorry. You're going to a king who committed genocide and killed everyone that they could find and continually hunts to kill anyone that they can find who doesn't have powers. And you think standing there and saying, hey, we're not bad, is going to do anything? There's no thought process here that makes sense. If there was a resistance, a true resistance, they needed to be doing things to undermine the king from the beginning. There needed to be some real tension there, because the only tension that's created is the idea that she has to find the tunnel, and she finds the tunnel by kind of manipulating Kit into going into the slums so that she can find a way out, which is the tunnel system. And then Kit just is like, oh, I'm gonna show you the key. Here's the key, how to get in. Here's how to get into the tunnels. Here's where this one goes. Here's where that one goes. Like, really? He's known Peyton for like maybe 3 weeks? And he's suddenly telling her all of his best kept secrets? Like, I have a hard time. I have a hard time with that one. I really do. So the rebellion pulls her in. This is in the middle of the trials. And, you know, the trials honestly don't matter. People die in the trials, except for the main characters that we're supposed to like. They don't die. Nobody of import dies until the very, very end, which even then it's a secondary character that we got to see for 2 seconds, who is her best friend. And she was introduced at the beginning. She's at the very end in the 3rd trial. And I will say, her death did get me a little bit, but it was very frustrating because she was introduced at page like 148 and then not really in the story again until page like 450. Like, there's no building of that character with us as the reader, so that when her death happens, it's really emotional. And I get emotional on deaths, especially if they're described really well. If you have read Fourth Wing, you're good, but minor spoilers if you haven't. But when Liam dies in Fourth Wing, I got emotional because I felt like Rebecca Yarros had spent a lot of time with Liam. And so when he died, it meant something. But in Powerless, Adina dies at the end, and we don't care because there was so much time. Now, it's not bad writing in that moment, but then she completely undercuts herself by explaining to us why this should be emotional. And this is kind of one of my final points. This video's gone on way too long anyway. But one of my final points in this is the writing itself it undermines itself left and right. She tells us what is happening instead of showing us what is happening through the entire book. She tells us that something is emotional, or she tells us how the characters feel, and she doesn't show us how they feel through physicality or through dialogue and discussion. It's all just told to us. One of the moments that really frustrated me with this was at the end with Adina. So Adina is in the center of this maze that is another straight ripoff from Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, the movie, where the maze is a hedge maze and it is magical and redoes itself all the time. But they get to the center and Adina's there, Peyton's best friend, and she is going to her, and another contestant comes in and throws a stick telekinetically, and it goes straight through Adina, and we know she's gonna die. It was kind of an emotional scene. The way that Lauren Roberts wrote it was really, really good. But then she completely undercuts it. So Adina's laying there in her arms, in Peyton's arms, and she's so sad. And she says something that she had said at the very beginning of the book. It was like the way they said goodbye to each other, which was, it's not goodbye. It's just a good time to say goodbye for now. And that was a really sweet line. And I really liked that. And then she had to ruin it by then explaining to us, well, this is what we said to each other back at the beginning. You didn't let it breathe. You didn't let it breathe at all. You went straight to, I must explain because my audience is stupid and they will not remember that that happened at the beginning of the book. I think most authors forget, especially young authors, forget that most people that read these books, if they really, really like them, they will read them in 1 to 2 days. You don't need to remind us of stuff that happened. We just read it like hours ago. It's okay. She didn't let it breathe. She could have let it breathe. And this is what I mean by it had a foundation of being a really, really, really good book. She just fumbled it at every opportunity. Now, I have a lot of other things that I wrote down, but you know, this video has gotten a little a little long in the tooth. So, my final thoughts on this book. It had potential. That potential was squandered pretty quickly. It's a straight ripoff, and if you want to read a book that is a staple, that is a really, really good one, just go read Red Queen and The Hunger Games. Now, the next book is slated to come out, I think it's called Reckless, is slated to come out at sometime this year. I will say I will probably read it. She did do a really good job with the very ending. Like the epilogue of the book was very good, but it's very obvious she wrote it a lot like farther in the future than she wrote the bulk of the book because the writing style is a little bit different. But overall, if it wasn't for the fact that I had a really good friend who wanted to talk to me about this book, I probably wouldn't have finished it. But I'll more than likely get the second one and probably listen to it on audiobook while I'm doing other things. But let me know what you think, because I would love to know if you liked the book. If you loved the book, please let me know. If you didn't like the book, please feel free to drop a comment and tell me what you didn't like. But keep it civil, please. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me today on this episode of The Clean PNR Girl, where I did my very first rant review. As always, remember, you are loved, you are worthy, and happy reading. Nope, that's not, Before we get started on my review of Powerless by Lauren Roberts, I want to tell you nothing, because this sucks.